Hi, my name is Greg Santor. I'm the head of the U.S. sports practice for the search firm Odgers Berndtson. I'm here today to moderate the panel for Athletic Directors University and their topic of diversity and inclusion. To my left, I have three esteemed colleagues who will introduce themselves.
Zenarae Antoine, the head women's basketball coach at Texas State University.
Rich Lapchick, the director of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport at the University of Central Florida.
Nicki Moore, Vice President and Director of Athletics at Colgate University.
Thank you. So in the most recent numbers issued by the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports, it cites that the percentage of female athletic directors in Division I has decreased from 11.2% to 10.5%. So while some will argue that the tides have started to change in terms of gender diversity and leadership in college athletics, the numbers seem to suggest otherwise. So to throw a few questions out there for the panel, why does it seem the progress has been so slow in increasing gender diversity in college sports when we know that more than half the student athlete population is female?
Well, it's not just college sport, first of all. It's all pro sport. The gender grades are going down. It's the most disturbing thing that we find in doing these racial and gender report cards is the opportunities for women at all levels, but particularly at senior leadership levels or coaching levels, has failed to move the needle forward.
You know, I suspect that it has something to do with the, for lack of a better term, sort of the patriarchal waters in which we swim. We've culturally for a long time sort of grown up, all of us have in some ways, in this broader space that suggests certain gender roles. And we're starting to blur those lines more. But, we all, I think, carry with us biases. And if we're not working really carefully to address those biases and start to act differently, then we often will play into what those biases suggest. And, one example that's kind of a stark example is in coaching. We sort of just automatically assume that women shouldn't be or won't be a part of the coaching candidate pools for male sports. Whereas, we generally pretty well accept that men might be a part of coaching pools for women's sports. And so that's just one example of how, I think that unless you question it and challenge it, then we maybe fall into those old kind of habits.
I think the other piece is an awareness piece if you're talking about the student athletes. I've been coaching for well over 20 years now, and I can tell you there hasn't been one time that I've had a young woman say, I want to be an athletic director, or I really think I want to get into compliance, or I think it'd be really fun to get into marketing athletics. The majority of them that have any interest in athletics, their thought process is I want to play professionally, or I really want to be a basketball coach. So as far as an awareness that is a career opportunity that they continue to, they can grow in, I think it's something that probably needs to be taken seriously looked at, because I truly can't think of a time that I've had a young woman say, even at the high school level, I want to be an athletic director. A lot of times they kind of go in other career paths, their minds do, and it may be more so we educating them on the opportunities that we have within athletics from an administrative standpoint that isn't just in coaching or the opportunity to play professionally.
The worst statistic we report every year is that among women's teams across all three divisions, more than 60% of the head coaches are men. And on assistant coaching level, more than 50% of the assistant coaches of all women's teams are men. And as you said, women coach about 2.5% of men's teams. When I go on a college campus and I talk to an athletic director and say, would you hire a woman to coach the men's team? I get looks like you must be crazy to be even asking me that question. But your point is really well taken and backed up, unfortunately, really statistically in a strong way.
Why do you think with Title IX, and you have now the second generation of female athletes who have played sports, who understand sports, have competed at the highest level, they've been able to be fans of games, articulate fans, know the sports, are better than some male counterparts. but there's still this stigma that they may not understand or be able to oversee football, or they may not oversee some other sports. I mean, when do you get over that? How do you get over that? I know you talked about challenging it at some point, but what else do you think needs to happen?
Well, again, the colleges are behind, but the pro level, the NFL has 5 women assistant coaches this year. The NBA has 3 women assistant coaches. Adam Silver's predicted there'll be a woman's head coach and a general manager within a year in the NBA. Those will be incredible days for the whole sports industry, college and pro.
So you think once the barrier gets broken at that level, it'll trickle down, or you hope it's going to trickle down? Is that the...
I would hope it will trickle down. I've seen this is where we thought we had a breakthrough and then nothing happens beyond that breakthrough. So I'm not totally optimistic about it, but I'm hopeful.
Gotcha. So we've talked about some of them. What are the biggest challenges you think for female leadership in college athletics in general, and maybe the stigmas that get attached to that?
There are still gender roles that women, I think, carry, and that are sometimes ascribed, whether directly or indirectly, and maybe, this could be an anthropological discussion, I suspect, on child rearing and having families and those sorts of things. But I can certainly say, as an athletics director, taking that role on, when I go into relationships now, I go in not just as myself, but as carrying the athletics director role with me. My husband also now carries the husband of the athletics director role with him, and it's a disorienting kind of experience in some ways, and it's not easy. And managing, they're really demanding roles. And so I'm not sure, there are these pieces of life that we don't necessarily have tidy buckets for ways of managing them and putting them in context where you can actually where women can truly just go for whatever role and jobs that they want to sometimes because of psychological barriers or otherwise. But we're not even really having conversations about that, I don't think, very broadly as a profession, to figure out how we can make those job transitions and work personal roles all fit together.
For me, looking as a coach versus an administrator, I go back to what I said before, an awareness for the athlete. I think the other piece sometimes for women in the sport is just having the mentorship. As a coach, if my thought process is I'd like to go into administration or some type of leadership role beyond coaching, just understanding what that would look like and someone kind of building you up along the way. And that's always going to take people that are going to, make the hires, and then being able to celebrate those women that are successful and being able to continuously, grow and help them in that venture, because that, again, much like the people that have been hired, the women that have been hired within the professional ranks, it's going to show there is a level of competency and there's a level of success. So the more successful those women are, and we're celebrating them and we're mentoring them along the way, you are going to have some breakthroughs, but it's going to take, people who are going to advocate for women and them stepping out of their comfort zone and being able to and willing to support them, especially those times when, we really need support as you navigate through those waters.
Nicki, I'm sorry.
Just one other quick thing. My president even mentioned that he had to do a fair bit of defending of his decision to hire a woman athletics director among those who, some of those who support the institution. And, so there just are still lingering stereotypes and biases that we're still fighting against. And fortunately, in my case, I had an advocate in my president. And then once I've gotten in the role, I think I've been able to demonstrate competency and those sorts of things. But you have to have that person who's willing to have the courage to have those hard conversations and educate along the way in order to get in the door.
Well, I think, from my side of the table, when we're doing these searches, whether it's an athletic director or a coach, there are these silent influencers in the decision maker's ear of what's it going to mean to the institution. Do they know football? Are they going to be able to take the program to the next level? Have they proven leadership, which is one of my next questions. So you do have to have advocates, on the search committee within the institution. They're going to say, you know what? So what? This person came in here and knocked our socks off. Whether it's male, female, whatever, they're going to come in here and the person who does the best is going to get the job. But there's always a knock that the women lead differently. And so, love to get your thoughts on, what you may see as the differences. Is that a myth? Is that the truth? Do they lead better, but people don't give them a shot? I mean, how would you comment on that? And that's open to everybody.
Well, I think also at play for that is, we've talked about sexism and cultural influences, but there's also a very real factor called the old boys network. So if you've got all men, especially all white men who are athletic directors, they're going to turn to people they know, and they're going to know fewer women. They're going to know fewer people of color in those decisions. Most hires in a college athletic department are not done through search firms. They're done through traditional searches. And unless we get diverse pools of candidates in those searches, which is something we've been advocating for a long time to make that mandatory at the college level, that's why the numbers haven't changed. They became mandatory in the NFL. They became mandatory in Major League Baseball. The numbers changed right away. I believe we need something like that at the college level.
Well, I would advocate for more search firms being used through the whole process for a lot of reasons. But, that's one thing we do pay a lot of attention to. We have relationships with women leaders. We have relationships with Lead One. We have relationships with the NCAA and everybody else where we're talking about diversity candidates all the time. And, who's ready, who's prepared, who's been trained, who's been mentored. Then we can let our institutions know that that's part of the kind of group you're going to see. It's hard to guarantee that when somebody is doing a search on their own and different people are calling different candidates and so forth. It's definitely different. But, going back to the leading differently piece, I'd love to get your thoughts.
I think so. I mean, I think it's hard to sort of put all women in a bucket and all men in a bucket, but I hope that women lead a little differently in some ways. And I think that when we bring our full self, when we are allowed to bring our full selves to the job, that we maybe bring even something that's adds a dimension. Now, if you think about leadership simply as decision making, evaluating options, analyzing those things that the decisions that are coming to you, probably not. But I do think in the way that we influence people, that varies from person to person. But I think you'd probably find some gender differences as well. And I know for me, on my first department-wide meeting, I stood up and talked about loving people. Like, I expect you to love people well. I've never heard a man talk about that. And frankly, I really like being able to talk about that. And I think it's good for our department and good for our staff to hear that. And in some ways, I think I feel some freedom to do that as a woman. But, not sure.
My dad played for the original Celtics, and when he did, the owner was a woman called Kate Smith. She was the first woman owner of a men's team, wasn't another one for 60 years, and the next ones inherited them. And my father's favorite person that he worked for was this woman because of how she led the team. She would ask them about their families, about what they're going to do in the off season, about what they're going to do when they finish playing basketball. She would ask them about them as human beings, not just people who are going to go out and win championships. I think they do lead differently, and I think it's a big plus.
It's a very interesting question you asked, because my life is different in that I'm also married to a Division I football coach. So I have the opportunity to see how he leads, as well as how I lead. I kind of equate it to, and I have all sons, so I'm raising sons. And so when I think about my leadership style, I do have to break it down. I would say, as far as the X's and O's go, the day-to-day operations, I don't think there's really a difference. But if you talk about from a personality type, we'll both show love. I might express that I love my players a lot more than he does. His might be, a nice word or a gentle nudge. So we do potentially lead differently, but I think if the coach's heart's in the right place, you're going to feel that as an athlete, for sure. In addition to that, at Texas State, we have a president who is a woman, and she has a husband, who is the president's spouse, the president's husband. And it's pretty neat because a lot of people aren't aware of that. So when I'm talking about our institution, and I talk about, her name's Dr. Trouth, and I talk about Dr. Trouth at any time I use a pronoun she, they say, oh, it's a woman? Yeah, it's a woman, which I think is pretty neat because they've seen our campus, and I think those are some of the gender biases that have to be broken down at times. That, we have a female leader on our campus, and she's doing great things. And as you look around, her stamp is in a lot of different places. So I do think that leadership can be seen in a lot of different ways. Women might lead differently, but I think for the most part, from a day-to-day operations, women that are successful are no different in their peers as far as the X's and O's. Just the modality of being able to lead the people around them is different.
With your point about the gender biases, and I think they not only can limit or hinder women's progress, but I think they also place limits upon men in ways that are unhealthy for them. And, in some ways you might think that the more educated we all become, the more self-examined we become about our own biases relative to gender or race or other diversity measures. Hopefully the more sort of multilingual we all might come. I hope that we have plenty of male leaders that could stand in front of a department and talk really freely and comfortably about love. Once we all start to break down some of those biases and limitations.
We touched on it a little bit earlier, but there's this sphere of influence around universities and colleges to begin with, and then the people who are in the ears of certain folks. There's donors, there's season ticket holders, there's alumni, there's coaches, there's a whole bunch of different folks who try to influence it. Do you think you have to, as a female, handle those people any differently? Or do you have a different approach? I know on some of our searches early on, we would have donors pull us aside and go, Greg, I think we need a male leader. Meanwhile, they are always the ones who wound up picking a female AD who knocks it out of the park. But they just more were fearful. They were old school. They were never been exposed to a woman who could sit there and really have a conversation about athletics. And, it kind of takes them by surprise. Now, I think we're definitely getting to a better place for folks having those conversations. But you still got to get in and do the job. And what happens when you get in there? How do you deal with those different folks as leaders? I'm sure you see it with hoops, with basketball all the time.
You do. I've spoken to some of our all-male church groups in the morning. I've spoken to Kiwanis. I've spoken to large groups, and I really find you really just need to be your authentic self. If you're yourself, if they're older, they might see someone they know in you, and there's something identifiable there. If you share stories about what truly it means to be a student athlete, I'm very fortunate to have been a Division I student athlete, and sharing those stories and talking about the impact that they have on our athletes on a day-to-day basis. Just being honest with them is really a way to connect. And if you're able to connect by being honest and sharing good stories about your program and those athletes, you're going to find that you have that situation, right, where originally you're thinking, hey, we need a man in this position, and they end up saying, hey, I kind of like this lady. I think she should do a great job with our athletes. I think that's a big piece of it, Greg.
I would echo many of the things that you said. And the other thing I would add is listening. I think I'd probably do a little bit more listening and sort of understanding where some of those biases might lie, and then be able to bring someone around. But your point about being authentic and fully yourself, eventually I think that wins almost anyone over.
Richard, you see the research all the time. Are there any statistics on, does it take longer for a female leader to win people over? Do they have to use different approaches to it, or is it pretty much the same skill set and that needs to be used at all levels?
I think that's a hard thing to measure statistically. I think those are personal traits and characteristics that the potential leaders would develop. But we also have to remember that getting the experience in developing that leadership is obviously yet another handicap for women, and particularly women of color and people of color, that they don't have that opportunity to build that by experience. Sometimes you have to take a risk and give a chance for someone who may not have demonstrated all you're looking for, because you feel that person has that potential. Might not have seen it, but you can sense it.
So a little risk taking involved. If you see they have that skill set, they have all the traits you're looking for, but somebody needs a little nudge. I always say this in our searches when we're looking at the search committee, that everybody in that room, usually somebody gave them a shot before they were ready for it. And most of them stepped up and took advantage of the opportunity. And I think that's where we are with a lot of these scenarios. For the last question, just kind of a closing thought from each of you. How do you think the leaders in collegiate athletics can help foster more leadership skills and more opportunities for females among the employees and in general, and more opportunities, to your earlier point, more awareness?
I think through conversation and through genuinely expressing care and concern about first of all, our staff's development, and not only our administrative staff, but our assistant coaches and our head coaches. Having professional development and out there as something that we're all thinking about on a regular basis is not something that happens everywhere, and is something that is not hard to do. And it starts to expand people's sort of consideration of what's possible for them. So I think talking about it is important. I think nudging folks in when you have opportunities, even simple things like community or committee service on campus, asking someone to step into a role that maybe they haven't served on your campus before. That again starts to just expand their own sort of image of what's possible. And then I think one thing that I do on a regular basis is just say yes. When someone, whether they be on your campus or not, particularly for women and minorities, when they approach me about mentorship or just to have a conversation, I try to make it a habit to always say yes. And I think that eventually grows the network and hopefully grows the possibilities for everyone.
And I think we can look at this as an opportunity as opposed to the problem that it is. I mean, when we look at America, we rank 100th globally in terms of women representing us at any kind of national level office. Sport is very visible, and when we can create these leadership positions and have women demonstrate that leadership, that's going to be an opportunity that can be seen by corporate America, by other spheres of education, by society in general, that we're not doing right now in our society.
And at the youth level, whether it be high school or when they reach us as collegiate athletes, just making sure that they have those opportunities, we need to advocate for them. And whether that be going back to our individual organizations and groups that do have the ability to make some of the hiring decisions or being able to mentor, making sure that we talk about, these student athletes, because in the day, it's truly about the student athlete. That's why we're all here is figuring out a way to make sure that there's an awareness. And once they have an awareness, I really do believe in this generation. Like, if there's an awareness, there's a want to. And if there's a want to, this group of kids, they're unstoppable, but they need to have the tools. And, that's part of our job as coaches and administrators, is to make sure that they have the tools. And that means we have to equip each other, make each other aware, and kind of put each other on notice, if you will, or, make sure we're accountable to each other and our colleagues to help these young folks out.
Oh, great. Well, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more debate on this. Thank you so much to the panel. I'm Greg Santor for Athletic Directors University.